Right. Happy Sabbath again, everyone. We have an hour to engage in a study. The last time I had the opportunity to share with you, we were doing a review of the line of the counterfeit. Right. Elder Tess highlighted that the Midnight Cry brought three histories into focus: those of modern Israel, um, that of the counterfeit or the papacy, and that of Protestantism. Right, and in each of those histories, there is that pattern that you see of failure, failure, and success. Each of those histories, rather than having two components as we previously understood in Alpha and Omega, we actually can see a three-part pattern within each of them. And that three-part pattern, of course, is failure, failure, and success. And we laid out a table. We drew out a table in our first study where we laid out the three histories, where we laid out this pattern in the histories of these three lines. So in our consideration of the counterfeit, we had started by looking at I think we discussed the principle that the papacy is ultimately a counterfeit of God's church. It's ultimately a counterfeit of the true movement. So a good place to begin would be to lay out the history of God's true movement, lay out that history, and then begin to lay out the history of the counterfeit and show how it parallels the history of the true movement. And I think the usefulness of this study is evident in that you're not only able to more clearly explain the history of the papacy from 1798, even before 1798, right up to the present, but the implication is that as you understand the history of the movement, you can track what you should expect to see with the papacy also, right? So we had laid out the true line. I'll just recap it because I don't think all of us were there. And forgive me again, the Zoom's in-house whiteboard is not the best, but it's what we have. So, beginning the history of the true. It begins in 538. And what was 538? What began in 538 was a period of scattering that takes you to 1798 as the church was scattered by the papacy. That period of scattering ends. 1798, God begins to raise up a prophet and reformer, William Miller, to begin a work of gathering. So there's a period of gathering from 1798 to 1844, October 22nd, 1844. Of course, intervening between 1798 and 1844, we see an increase of knowledge followed by a formalization of the message that was carrying forward that work of gathering. But they come to the disappointment in 1844 and this inaugurates another period of scattering. And we identified that this scattering ended in 1850. What happened in 1850 to mark the end of the scattering? you have the 1850 chart being produced, which inaugurated a new period of external evangelism for the Advent movement. Right? And here the message went to the world. Okay. So from 1850 onwards, you have another period of gathering. And this period of gathering ended in 1863. And in 1863, we see two developments. One was organization. And organization was good. And the other development you see is the rejection of the message, the rejection of the 25-20. And this was bad. So okay. And that takes you to 1888. And what you see in 1888, of course, is that controversy between Jones and Waggoner. Against the GC president at the time, which was G.I. Butler, and Uriah Smith. Okay, then you come to 1989. 1989 marking the end of this period of scattering that you see taking place from 1863 and ending in 1989. So this is the history of the troop. And I think we got this far the last time that we were together. So we began to lay out how the history of the counterfeit parallels this that we're seeing. Okay, let me give it more space. Okay. And we had started going into it. Of course, 538 marks the beginning of a period of scattering. So what we must expect to see with the papacy, there's a period of scattering that we should be able to identify, right? And when was this scattering? I guess by way of recap, this was in 1798. This is when the Pope was taken captive by Napoleon and his general. We've spoken about how it's a principle that when God's people go into apostasy, they are suffered to go into captivity. So the same principle is true with the counterfeit. 1798, it went into captivity, and it went into captivity because there was an apostasy that preceded it, reason from cause to effect. And what was that apostasy? We saw that in 1773. Sorry, I'm gonna try to get that. It's a bit difficult. There we go. In 1773, the Pope abolished the Jesuit order. And why did he do that? He abolished the Jesuit order because he was under pressure from the kings of Europe, right, to rein in the Jesuits. And the Jesuits were the ones at the forefront of doing the work of persecution. And the papacy's work in that time period, its role, its mission that had been given to it by its God, who is Satan, was to persecute the saints. But now you come to this point where the kings of Europe essentially back the papacy into a corner, and they say, we will respect your claims to certain lands, right, in return for the abolition of the Jesuit order. And the papacy went into apostasy on this point. Rather than pursue the mission that had been given to them by their master, they chose temporal prosperity, they chose lands and wealth, and they agreed to abolish the Jesuit order, right, which abolition took place in 1773. So that cause produced an effect, which was the scattering that took place, that began in 1798. The last time I shared about how the history that is covered in this line of the counterfeit, it's dealt with quite thoroughly in two books that are worth reading. I'm sure many of us have long reading lists as it is, but these two books are Hitler's Pope, which is the one I have. I've only read portions of it, and the other one is His Holiness. But Hitler's Pope is a very good book, and it's the book that Elder Tess drew from quite a lot to lay out this history, the history of the line of the counterfeit. So there was a scattering that began in 1798. Okay, so following the scattering, according to the pattern that is laid out by the true, a gathering should be seen. And with that gathering, there is a reformer, or a prophet, shall we say, who is raised up to inaugurate that work. And 1798, as Miller was raised up at the end of the scattering of the church, 1899, Eugenio Pacelli, he began his rise. Eugenio Pacelli would eventually become the Pope, and he began his rise in 1899 by becoming a priest that same year at the age of 23. Right, he was ordained on April 2nd, 1899. And I think we spoke about Pacelli, about how he came from a family of Vatican lawyers that were extremely dedicated to the papacy. His father was Mark Antonio Pacelli, who was the primary lawyer for the Pope about 60 years prior. And he had a brother, Francesco, who was also trained under the same cardinal that Eugenio would train under, Cardinal Gaspari. And Cardinal Gaspari was himself one of the Pope's trusted lawyers. I'll ask if we remember, what were these two brothers played a pivotal role they played an important role, respectively, in guiding the papacy on its rise from the losses that it had suffered in its scattering in 1798. and we discussed our study. I just want to ask if anyone recalls what work is Eugenio known for principally, and what work is his brother Francesco known for principally as well. Do you remember that?
The canon law.
Yes, and we're going to say more about canon law, but do you have any more about it, and who one of them was responsible for that?
Was it Francesco that was actually responsible for the canon law?
Sorry, I just said my internet froze out for a second there.
Sorry, your internet froze, so I didn't understand what you said.
Oh, yeah, that was weird. Sorry, my internet froze out. Froze out for a second. Eugenio Pacelli, he was responsible for a prominent piece of legislation. The canon law was something that he did, but he was responsible for a prominent piece of legislation, as was his brother. And these pieces of legislation figured prominently in, again, the papacy's rise, its assumption of its position in the modern world following the scattering in 1798.
Was it to do with getting the money? I can't remember.
No, it wasn't to do with money. All right, so Eugenio, yes, he was responsible for the Reichskonkordat. Which was a treaty entered into with Hitler. And this treaty was a crucial step in Hitler's cementing his position in Germany, preparatory to launching World War II. Right, so the Catholic Church played a prominent role in facilitating Hitler's strong arming Germany, taking that sort of dictatorial control over Germany, which enabled him to then pursue the wars of the Second World War. And Francesco, yes, just as is stated in the comments from the Moghenis, thank you, he was responsible for the Lateran Treaty. Right, the Reichskonkordat was entered into with Germany, right? And the Lateran Treaty was entered into with Italy. Germany under Hitler and Italy under Mussolini. And the Lateran Treaty was the treaty which gave statehood to the Vatican, recognized the Vatican as a state within the city of Rome, as a state within Italy, and therefore fully sort of deserving of the protections of statehood, sovereignty, and so on and so forth. That was the Lateran Treaty. So both these brothers played important roles in the history of the modern papacy by cementing those two pivotal pieces of those two pivotal agreements. So Eugenio, he began studying canon law after becoming a priest. And he received his doctorate in canon law in 1904 at the age of 28 years old. His expertise in canon law becomes important when we start looking at his role in Germany and the work that he did with Hitler. So he began his studies of canon law. He received his doctorate in canon law in 1904, and his sort of update of what is canon law, first and foremost? It's the sort of system of laws, the legal system that the papacy has to govern the church's affairs. And there's that element of canon law which dictates how the papacy carries itself in entering into agreements with foreign nations. So that's what the canon law was about in a nutshell. So this canon law, his revision or update of the canon law was finished in 1917, which parallels the increase of knowledge. Right, so as a waymark, if 1818 is the increase of knowledge as a waymark, May 1917 is the waymark at which the increase of knowledge in the line of the counterfeit can be identified. The canon law was finished in May 1917. What was also taking place in 1917? That very same month, what happened? Within the realm. Yep. You said Fatima, yeah? So May 1917 was also Fatima. Okay, so in 1916, an angel came down 3 times, counterfeiting the 3 angels' messages. And this prepared them for the 13th of May, 1917, when an apparition of Mary supposedly came down, right? So you have May 1917 as the increase of knowledge, and you have the counterfeit message being given at that point. So there's more that can be said about Fatima that I won't be going through in this study. But suffice to say, right, May 1917, that's the increase of knowledge. So on the 13th of May, 1917, while Mary was appearing in Fatima in the Sistine Chapel, you have another development, which was that Pacelli was being consecrated as an archbishop. So on the very same day, so he finishes the canon law in 1917. Fatima happens in 1917, in May 1917. And on the very same day Fatima is happening, Pacelli is being consecrated as an archbishop. And again, on the same day, 13th of May. And why was this necessary? Because he needed that position to do the work that he was going to do in Germany. He needed that position to do the work that he was going to do in Germany. So I'll attest, if in the book Hitler's Pope, well, Hitler's Pope is the only book that I'm referencing here, so I'll put page 273. This is the part of the book that speaks about Fatima and Pacelli's response to it, right? And what was going on around this time period. So, you know, if you're not in a position to read a whole book, there's some key portions that you can be directed to, that may be useful to focus on. So page 273, this is the part that speaks about Fatima, and Pacelli was a believer in Fatima. He gave credence to it, and he saw providence in this timing, right? The providence in the timing of the apparition of Mary, as well as his being consecrated at the very same time. But of course, he failed to accomplish the purpose of Fatima in his tenure as Pope, the purpose being to dedicate Russia. And we're going to see why he failed. So we come back to the point about the purpose of the canon law. The canon law that he revised and updated. Remember that in this time period, this is a period of gathering. And the canon law was needed to facilitate that gathering process, the attempt of the papacy to consolidate its power, because up until that point, the organizational structure of the church had been pretty decentralized. And what this canon law did was that it tightened that up. It centralized power in the papacy itself, in the Vatican. So the purpose of the canon law was to bring the spread out church more closely under the control of the central structure. And again, this was needed in that work of resurrecting the papacy from 1917 onwards. Because again, there's that principle which says first the church and then the world. The church must first get its act in order before it can go out and do the work for the world. That's true internally, but it's also true in the life of the counterfeit. And with this decentralized church that existed at the time, it was not in a position to fulfill the work that Satan wanted it to do. It needed to centralize, which is what the Code of Canon Law facilitated. And it became especially important in the context of the German church, because the German church was an important center of power in the Catholic Church, a center of influence, and it was particularly independent, and it was critical of Hitler. So the German church needed to be subdued and brought into line to get out of Hitler's way, because the church, the church had an interest in working with Hitler. We understand that principle that the papacy rides a beast. It does not do the work itself. It does not operate directly, right? There's always a beast that it is riding at any point in time. And Nazi Germany, Hitler, that was the beast that it was attempting to ride to fulfill its purpose of defeating communism as represented by the Soviet Union, but by Russia, consecrating Russia, defeating Russia, but also, as a step towards regaining the position that it held on the world stage previous to its scattering in 1798. So that brings us to 1933. What happened in 1933? Oh, sorry, no. My mistake. 1933 is here, the formalization. So in the line of the true, you have the message, there's an increase of knowledge on the message. Then the message is The message is formalized in 1833. So we see the same thing with the papacy. The formalization in 1933, this was the Concordat, the Reichskonkordat. This marks the formalization. So I have a few notes here from Wikipedia about this this agreement, the Reichskonkordat. I will share my screen. Share my screen. So these are just from Wikipedia. And it says, the Reichskonkordat is a treaty negotiated between the Vatican and the emergent Nazi Germany. It was signed on the 20th of July, 1933, by Cardinal Secretary of State Eugenio Pacelli, who later became Pope Pius XII, on behalf of Pope Pius XI and Vice Chancellor Franz von Papen, on behalf of President Paul von Hindenburg and the German government. It was ratified on the 10th of September 1933, and it has been in force from that date onward. The treaty guarantees the rights of the Catholic Church in Germany. When bishops take office, Article 16 states that they are required to take an oath of loyalty to the governor or president of the German Reich, established according to the Constitution. The treaty also requires all clergy to abstain from working in and for political parties. Nazi breaches of the agreement began almost as soon as it had been signed and intensified afterwards, leading to protests from the church, including in the 1937 Brennendes Sorge, so I probably butchered that, encyclical of Pope Pius XI. The Nazis planned to eliminate the church's influence by restricting its organizations to purely religious activities. The Reichskonkordat is the most controversial of several concordats that the Vatican negotiated during the pontificate of Pius XI. It is frequently discussed in works that deal with the rise of Hitler in the early 1930s and the Holocaust. The Concordat has been described by some as giving moral legitimacy to the Nazi regime soon after Hitler had acquired quasi-dictatorial powers through the Enabling Act of 1933, an act itself facilitated through the support of the Catholic Center Party. The treaty places constraints on the political activity of German clergy of the Catholic Church. Following the passage of the 1937 Nuremberg laws, for example, a policy of non-intervention was followed. The majority of the German church hierarchy regarded the treaty as a symbol of peace between church and state. From a Catholic Church perspective, it has been argued that the Concordat prevented even greater evils being unleashed against the church. Though some German bishops were unenthusiastic and the Allies at the end of World War II felt it inappropriate, Pope Pius XII successfully argued to keep the Concordat in force. It is still in force today. So you have this Concordat, this piece of legislation. I'll come back to our whiteboard. Well, that's a disaster. It erased all that boardwork that we had. Anyway, that's okay. We'll just quickly lay it out again. And remember not to, I guess with Zoom you have to save it, it won't keep it. So we had 1798, marking the beginning of the scattering, which takes us to 1899. 1917, you have Fatima, the message, increase of knowledge on the message. 1933, you have the canon law. You have the Reichskonkordat, which was an important step in facilitating the fulfillment of the message, coming into that alliance with Nazi Germany. Then, of course, we come to 1945. Okay, so this is where we are. So here you have Pacelli. Right, then here you have Fatima. And here you have the Concordat. Okay, so this is a period of gathering. So what happens in 1945? So I think before we come to that 1945, so you have the papacy settling upon entering into that alliance with Germany, reigning in the German church, subordinating them to the German state, so that that sort of like section of opposition to Hitler's assumption of dictatorial power, so that that section of opposition was neutralized. That's what the Reichskonkordat did, right? And we also read from Wikipedia that breaches of the Concordat by the Germans began almost immediately. Hitler almost immediately began to break his end of the bargain and began to take steps to suppress the influence of the German church. The Wikipedia page goes into more detail on that. But that's what he began to do. So you have this situation where the papacy settles on a beast that it wants to ride, right? A beast that it wants to ride towards the purpose of accomplishing, fulfilling the message that it had been given for its time, which was Fatima. But this beast was not cooperative. You know, the beast it had chosen did not want to be ridden. Hitler was too independent, right? Then you come to 1945. What happens? Hitler's defeated. That's the end of World War II. And the defeat of Hitler, what is that to the church? You remember, well, we've lost our diagram on top here, but this is the disappointment. (1945) is the disappointment, paralleling the Great Disappointment on October 22nd, 1844. And just as the Great Disappointment marks the beginning of a period of scattering, 1945 marks another period of scattering. Okay, so a bit about 1945. Pope Pius, Pacelli, who was now Pope Pius. I have it here when he became Pope. He became Pope in 1939, and he was Pope until 1958. So Yeah, 1939 to 1958. So by the end of World War II, he was the Pope. And he was always careful not to give Hitler his public endorsement. He knew Hitler would go to war with Russia. And my brother Mario Adams, you're asking why was the scattering in 1945? I don't know. I guess my thing is I don't know how familiar you are with this study of the counterfeit. So I'm a little not sure about how to begin to answer that question. But I'll say this, that we have the history of the church, and the history of the church, there's a pattern that is seen, right? From 538 to 1798, there's a scattering. The church is scattered. And then from 1798 to 1844, there's a period of gathering where God gathers the Advent movement. And in this period of gathering, there is the increase of knowledge, followed by the formalization of the message. Then in 1844, you have a disappointment, the Great Disappointment. And you can read, early writings, for example, that from 1844 onwards, the church was in a scattered condition. So we're just tracking the same pattern with the counterfeit, with the papacy. We've seen a period of scattering, followed by a period of gathering where reformers raised up. In 1798, it was Miller. In 1899, it was Pacelli, who would later become Pope Pius. Jonathan's asking, let me see, you're asking, was it a disappointment for the papacy with the failure of Germany to win the war? That's how I understand it, right? That the Germany was the beast that the papacy was seeking to ride. He knew Germany would make war against Russia, and the defeat of Russia was, I guess, part of what they understood had to be done. The consecration of Russia. The defeat of Russia and communism was part of what they understood to be their mission, as stated at Fatima. So when Germany is defeated, that's a disappointment, right? The beast that they put their money on, that they had attempted to ride, that they put their money on to help them accomplish this mission, it failed. So that's how I understand it, that the defeat of Germany was the disappointment. It lost the beast that it was trying to ride. So I hope that helps. Feel free to state if you have any thoughts on that. So 1945, it's the disappointment in the line for the papacy, in the counterfeit parallel, the disappointment in 1844, right? Pope Pius, he was careful not to publicly endorse Hitler. He knew Hitler would go to war with Russia. And as a student of Fatima, he knew Hitler would be important in that work, but he was careful not to endorse him publicly. And now the text makes reference to page 229 of Hitler's Pope. Page 229 of Hitler's Pope. The Allied powers, on the other hand, they wanted him to speak out against the German atrocities, but he never did. He never did so over the course of the entire war. And the reason for that, his motive, at least one of his motives, was he hoped that in the event that Germany lost, right? He's hedging his bets, if we put it that way. In the event that Germany lost, he hoped to secure a role as mediator between the Allies and the Nazis and their is it Axis? Or was that World War I, where it's Axis and Allies? Germany, he hoped to secure a role as a mediator between the two sides, and by securing a role as mediator between the world powers the major powers of the world, that would springboard the papacy's influence as a political actor on the world stage. So I think you see that logic. So they're looking to Germany because they know that Germany is going to be important in fighting against Russia, because the defeat of communism is what they want, as mandated by Fatima. But in the event that Germany loses and a truce needs to be called, he was hoping that by remaining neutral, he would be looked to as an impartial mediator when the time came to sign a truce, and the papacy's influence on the world stage would increase that way. But it didn't happen that way. It didn't happen that way because in 1945, when Hitler lost, the Allied powers were, throughout the war, they were calling on him to take a position. When he didn't, they were disgruntled by that. So now when Germany had been defeated, they were not calling upon him for anything. They did not call upon him to mediate. The papacy was just sidelined. So he had no choice. He begrudgingly endorsed democracy after that. So 1945 was just a year of failure for them. It was just, Germany lost, and then they weren't, they were sidelined. It was just a disappointment all around for them in 1945. So 1945, you have a period of scattering. Over here, the scattering ended in the line of the truth. The scattering ended in 1850. And 1850, you have the 1850 chart, which inaugurated a new phase of evangelism to the world. You have the message going to the world. So you should have the parallel development after 1945. But before I come to that, I just want to speak to my brother's question. Why was there scattering in 1945? So Brother Mario, does that help? I hope that helps in explaining why there was a scattering in 1945. Let me know if you need me to elaborate on that. Okay, so when do we see the development parallel in 1850? 1850, you have a gathering, right? A period of gathering, a new period of evangelism to the world, a gathering into the church. You see that in 1950. Okay, that's good, Mario. See that in 1950. So 1850 marks the printing of a new chart in the Advent movement and a gathering. This parallels what the papacy called the Holy Year of 1950. The Holy Year of 1950 for the Catholic Church. And what took place was, here the papacy adopted the dogma of the Assumption. The dogma of the Assumption. And he used, for the first time, the doctrine of papal infallibility was used to establish a dogma. Was essentially, what's a dogma? A dogma is a doctrine, a particular article of faith. And the papacy, the Pope in and of himself has not used the power of his position as the vicar of Christ to dictate doctrine, right? But this was the first time that, that claim of papal infallibility was used, without, was used to dictate doctrine for the church. So what was the significance of this dogma of the Assumption? What was the significance of this dogma of the Assumption? Well, if you look at that history, go back a decade, from 1940, you have Franco, the dictator of Spain. He had been using the cult of the Assumption as a rallying cry against communism, right? Firstly, the dogma of the Assumption is the idea that Mary was assumed into heaven, body and soul. I think also the idea is without seeing death. That she went into heaven. She ascended to heaven. Similar, like Elijah did, essentially, body and soul into heaven. And Franco, the dictator of Spain, he was fighting against the sort of communist influences within his own country, and the cult of the Assumption, it was a rallying cry for the Catholic Church against the communist elements in Spain at the time. So Pacelli used the dogma of the Assumption to the same purpose, right? It inspired loyalty within the church. It was a rallying cry. It promoted widespread crusades, among other things. So in 1850, there's a new evangelistic thrust. There is a new push, right? And you see the same thing in 1950 with the Counterfeit. There is a new push that is being facilitated by the dogma of the Assumption. And then 1958, Pacelli dies, and then a new Pope, John the 23rd, comes in. Right, and John the 23rd becomes significant as we look at the next waymark. So 1850, what followed 1850? You have 1863. And in 1863, what happened? You remember we said there were two developments. One was organization, which was good. The other was the rejection of the 2520, the rejection of the message, which was bad. So when we come to the line of the Counterfeit, we should come to a point where we see two parallel developments to 1863. And we see that in 1962. What happened in 1962? Pope Pius's successor, he died in 1958. He was succeeded by Pope John the 23rd. And Pope John the 23rd announced the Second Vatican Council. Now, the Vatican Council, this is where it's like a council where all the top brass of the church, representation from all over the world, they converge on the Vatican, and they literally conduct a review. Essentially, everything is fair game for review, right? They conduct a review of the church's beliefs. Major doctrines are reviewed, revised, done away with, new doctrines adopted, and so on. These councils are big. We're in Vatican II. The Second Vatican Council was in 1962. We're in 2021. There hasn't been one, right? So these things, they're not held often. they're a big thing. They're turning points in the history of the Catholic Church. So you have reorganization, and the thrust of Vatican II was there was a doctrinal thrust, but there was also an organizational thrust dealing with how the church organized. So this council began in 1962, and it proposed to reorganize the church. So there was the organizational element, and this was good. But what also happened?
Wasn't that part of the three things you had to do or something?
What do you mean?
Like they had to do three things according to Fatima, right? Wasn't one to gather all the popes or something?
No. No, that wasn't one of them. That wasn't one of them. I'd have to go back and look at what exactly those three things were, but I know that wasn't one of them. Right, so you have Vatican II, 1962. You have the thrust to reorganize, which was good. But you also have a negative development, the rejection of the message. Because 1863, you have the organization of the Adventist Church. That was good. But you have the rejection of the message. The 2520 was rejected, which is bad. So in 1962, you have organization, which according to the model is good. It was what the Catholic Church needed to do. But you also see that they rejected their message. And how did they do that? Pope John, the 23rd, he entered into a deal with the Soviet Union because he wanted all the churches there. But Russia, the Soviet Union, the church was kept under the state's thumb. They were repressed and tightly controlled by the state. But he wanted representation by the Russian Orthodox Church at Vatican II. The Soviets wouldn't let that happen. So they struck a deal that in exchange for letting the Russian Orthodox Church attend, the Catholic Church, the Pope would not issue an encyclical condemning communism, because that was the plan, that at those proceedings, a significant encyclical, the most strident condemnation of communism was going to be given by the Pope at that council. But he agreed to not issue that condemnation in exchange for the Russians releasing the Orthodox Church to attend. And this was against the instructions of Fatima, right? Because Fatima was the message about, it was a message against communism, right? That Russian communism needed to fall. But here he is agreeing not to play that part by, not to condemn communism. So you can see how clearly that is against the message of Fatima. So just as here you have the message rejected again, message rejected, just as you see in 1863. Okay, so we're coming to the end of our time. We'll just move through the remainder quickly. Okay, so from 1863. Okay, so I'm gonna skip over a few things here. So we identified 1888. And 1888, you have Jones and Wagner. Versus Butler and Smith. What is the parallel to 1888 in the line of the counterfeit? 1989. So what happens in 1989? 1888 was a failure, right? 1989, therefore, the parallel, it's also a history of failure. And here, Pope John Paul II, who was Pope at this time, 1888, a message is given, and the church fails. The church rejects that message and fails to do the work it should have done in receiving that message itself, first and foremost, and then spreading that message to the world. So it failed in its mission. 1989, same thing in the Catholic Church. It was a failure on three fronts, right? It was a failure because one, Pope John Paul II, he was a believer in Fatima. You remember an assassination attempt was made on his life. And following that assassination attempt, he became converted to Fatima, or became converted anew to Fatima, because he believed himself to be the Pope in the third vision who was killed. There's a Pope that is killed in the third vision. He believed that was a reference to him and that he was spared in mercy to give him another chance to pursue the work of bringing down Russia. So he was a believer in Fatima, but he failed on three fronts. And those three fronts were one, Russia did not fall to the papacy. Even though the Soviet Union fell, Russia did not go to the papacy. The Eastern European states, the satellite states of the Soviet Union, they chose democracy. It was his hope that as they turned from communism, they would turn to the Catholic Church to rule over them, as they did in the Middle Ages, right? It would turn to the Catholic Church to rule over them as the Church ruled over, states in the Middle Ages. But they didn't turn to the papacy; they turned to democracy as the system that they would follow. And if you study what the papacy says and believes about democracy, they condemn democracy. They don't believe it's a good thing at all, right? So those Eastern European states, such as Poland, which Pope John Paul had put so much effort into wrenching from the hands of the Soviet Union, they adopted communism. They adopted democracy rather than turning to the papacy. And within the church itself, the church was quite stunningly divided at that time. And there was significant opposition that he received from within the church. That was at times even of a nature you could call a sabotaging opposition that he was receiving from within his own church. Right, and that opposition, there's that book, and I have this book. It's an intriguing read. It really is. It really is a good read. This book is the Jesuits. By Malachi Martin. Okay. Pope John Paul was conservative. the liberal wing of the church was headed by the Jesuits. And the book details the history of the conflict between these liberal and conservative factions within the church. And the liberals won out. The liberals, they really hindered John Paul II, and they, to this day, they win out because they got their pope, right? A liberal pope who's a Jesuit himself, Pope Francis. You also see the opposition to John Paul II and his conservative faction. You see it in the St. Gallen group, which began to be spoken of, a couple of decades later, around 2006. Well, no, a decade, 1995, 96. The same. You see that's the time when the St. Gallen group began to be active, and they met for 10 years up until 2006, right? And their purpose was to redirect the Catholic Church in a liberal direction, and they're the ones who pinpointed Francis as a suitable pope to meet their interests. So 1989 was a failure. Was a failure for the papacy, paralleling 1888, which was a failure for the Adventist Church. So just before 1888, we're coming to the end here, you have 1886. What happened in 1886? There was an argument between Wagner and Butler being the conference president, leading up to 1888. In 1886, Butler produced a pamphlet called The Law and the Book of Galatians. And what he was doing was he was fighting against various writing and publications that Wagner had been putting out on the same book of Galatians. And so this controversy over the law in Galatians, it split the church between the new God, the new young crowd, Jones, Wagner, and the old guard, Butler, Smith, and others. And it played a major role in souring the atmosphere in the church to where by the time 1888 came, people just were not willing to listen to each other. That if it came from a certain person, they were rejecting it. And because Jones and Butler were the vehicles for the communication of that message of righteousness by faith, the leaders of the church rejected it. So 1888, Ellen White released a statement saying neither of them had all the light on Galatians. Neither position was perfect that each of them was presenting. They were half right and half wrong, if we use that terminology. So when we come to 1989, John Paul II is half right and half wrong as the leader of the church in the positions that he's taking. That's what the structure communicates, right? Where was he wrong? He was wrong in that he should not have opposed the work of the Jesuits. The Jesuits had the right idea, particularly in the area of organization, right? He should not have opposed the work of the Jesuits, but he did. And in 1987, 2 years before, that's when this book, The Jesuits, was written by Malachi Martin. So the book, The Jesuits, parallels the document published by Butler in 1886, right? That document called The Law and the Book of Galatians by 1886. So is that parallel? And that brings, in the line of the truth, that takes you to 1989, right? Bringing to an end this long period of scattering. So 1989, you have a gathering here. So what's the parallel to 1989? It's 2013. So you have a period of scattering from 1962 to 2013. And what happens in 2013? On the 13th of March, there are all these 13s, which is interesting. On the 13th of March 2013, remember Fatima was on the 13th of May. On the 13th of March 2013, someone was raised up to gather the scattered church, and this was Pope Francis. His calling, as they tell it, is to rebuild the temple, and he's working to bring the church under control, primarily in the US, which is where most of the opposition within the church is coming from. Okay, so you have this 1989, the true reformatory movement. The true has been in a period of gathering. From 2013 onwards, the papacy is similarly in a period of gathering. This is the final gathering of the true church, beginning in 1989, the final gathering of the movement that leads to the second coming. So this is likewise the final development, the final gathering of the Catholic Church, leading to the Sunday law and the close of probation and Christ's second coming. So that brings us to the end of this study. It's just a recap. I've not brought anything new. It's just a recap of the study as Elder Tess presented it on the counterfeit. Remembering that she highlighted 3 lines that light has been shed on by the Midnight Cry message. These are modern Adventism, the counterfeit, which is the papacy, and apostate Protestantism. Right? Those are the 3 lines. So, as though it'd be good to recap these 3 lines that were put on the record some time ago. We spent a lot of time more recently on Protestantism, and I think, maybe whatever I next get to share, I'll share on that. Do I have any questions or points before we close? Yes.
Yes, to me?
Yes, Jonathan, I think you're first, yeah.
Okay. I've been wondering, because I thought before we used to say that the counterfeit was counterfeiting the SDA church, but I thought at some point we had said that it was also counterfeiting this movement. And I don't know which one of those it would be, because like if you look at the papacy today, they still reject the ordination of women, which is more in line with the SDA church. But at some point, I thought we were saying that, and I forget what the evidence was that we showed, but that the papacy was actually counterfeiting this movement. So is it counterfeiting the SDA church and not this movement? Because they can't really do both, can they?
I guess I get your point. Oh, that was my mistake. I removed that. But before I come to that, let me send the diagram. I have a PDF of the diagram that I drew out. Let me just put it in the chat, and then we'll come to your question. Let me just put it in the chat. Sorry, my machine is acting a bit slow. I need to reboot. Okay. Sorry, please bear with me. There, so it's being uploaded to the chat. I mean, I get your question. Is it counterfeiting? Is it counterfeiting this movement, or is it counterfeiting the Adventist Church? I don't know. I'd have to think about that, because I think we see. Because as we look at the line of the true, 538 to 1989, I guess this is encompassing I mean, it is the history, it's the history of the Adventist Church, but it is also the history of this movement.
I thought at some point there was something that we had said about, we drew action between Jeff, Tess, and Parminder, and was it Pope John Paul II or whoever the last one was, and Benedict and Francis.
Yeah, but I guess I'm wondering, was it part of this line?
It might not have been. I think that.
Yeah, that's the thing, because there were a number of studies that I watched where she's drawing out lines, where she's making those parallels, but they're not this line. And how I related to them was essentially they're separate lines, they're separate concepts, they're different parables, right? You know, and I guess a thought I had was, after having laid out this, maybe to recap some of those other lines that she was presenting. But I had viewed them as separate to this particular line of thought, which was the first one that she presented.
Okay, well, that makes sense.
Yeah, so I mean, that's the best answer I have right now. It's something definitely to look into, to become clearer on. Does anyone have any thoughts on that? Please feel free to download. The chart is a PDF. I've uploaded to the chat. You can download it, so you have it. Okay, so if there are no more comments or questions, we can close the word of prayer. Let's pray. Oh, sorry. By the way, my sister, yes. Sorry, you had a.
No, as about the book, The Jesuits, there's something you said about it that I missed. I just wanted you to repeat. You said it. What about the book? I'm sorry.
About what?
The book, The Jesuits.
The Jesuits. Oh, it's a really insightful book. You know, it's really insightful in terms of the operations of the Catholic Church, what's gone on in the Catholic Church, really from the 19th century through the 20th century, and this division, this internal division that they have between the liberal branch and its conservative branch, and the liberal branch being spearheaded by the Jesuits, and how Vatican II was the major triumph of the Jesuits, you know, leading up to now, where they have their own pope, the pope who fulfills their agenda. And it's a pretty big book, but it's a really interesting read. It kind of keeps you engaged, you know. Who says history is boring? It doesn't have to be, you know. Yeah, so The Jesuits by Malachi Martin. And Malachi Martin was, he was one of Pope John Paul's most trusted advisors. So you know where he's coming from in how he presents it. He's an ally of John Paul. In fact, the book is called Jesuits and the betrayal of the Roman Catholic Church. So he's clear what perspective he's approaching it from. But yeah, it's a really interesting book.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Trevor, I think you're about to say something. No? No? Okay. All right, everyone. Thank you for your time. Let's close the word of prayer. Father in heaven, we thank you for the opportunity to recap truths that, Lord, were put on record really not long ago, but so much has happened, Lord, that maybe we may lose sight of these things. We thank you for this time that you're giving us, Lord, to go over the midnight cry, to go over all this vast light that you've opened up to us. Help us to be solidified in it in preparation for that which you are about to bring to light. Lord, it's the Sabbath day. Please bless us. May you please be in each home represented here today. Lord, may you grant us your spirit. We're still in Jacob's time of trouble. And many, Lord, are going through severe trials. Some, Lord, that no one else knows about, but you do. So, Lord, we ask for your help. We ask for your blessing. May you please be with us through the remaining hours of the Sabbath. And may you please be with us in the week ahead. For we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.